everyone. Thanks for making it out for the talk today. Really, what we want to make sure we cover today are some of the oft overlooked aspects of CMMC implementations, mostly because there's sort of some confusion when we get into these conversations with organizations. It's not a particularly helpful component of the fact that CMMC has cybersecurity in the name of the model. And really, at the end of the day, CMMC is much more of a data privacy model for confidentiality only. And so it shifts some of the emphasis that we would see from implementing a holistic cybersecurity program just into the confidentiality categories. And there's just a lot of components of CMMC that organizations kick over the fence to their technical teams, to their existing IT teams, their infrastructure teams, their security teams, their managed IT service providers, their vendors, and they're going to get responses back in as much as those technical teams help with these implementations. But as we were alluding to earlier, some of the things that we're going to be graded against in the future are much more non-technical activities or documentation or definitions or decisions the organization needs to make that then set up and enable the technical implementation to be completed successfully and then be assessed successfully. So if we think about a successful implementation, if you suddenly had to take a call and leave the room and couldn't make the rest of the talk today, and I could only impart one piece of information to you, it's this. We have to take these broad, high-level requirements that we see in CUI safeguarding requirements from 800.171 and CMMC, and we have to transform them into a set of arguable claims. So what is an arguable claim? It's something that I can say about my program or a decision that is defined enough that someone can choose to either agree or disagree with that claim. So something that's overly broad and generic is not helpful because it doesn't hone in on the actual decisions that have been made. Coincidentally, arguable claims sort of occupy the same space as assessor bias and opinion. So if we can sort of force our claim into that position, we have a much better control over our outcomes. So when we get into the CMMC model itself, there's all the usual things that we would talk about with the model, but just remember, as we've talked about before, at level 3, CMMC is mostly built off the back of NIST 800.171. So when we think about building out the overall non-technical worldview for CMMC itself, just jump back into 800.171, and we'll be given a couple of interesting tidbits that help us sort of unfurl this entire system that we need to have in place. So you can see here we're given a cautionary note up front in 800.171 Rev 2. So everything that you're going to read in the requirements in this document, they came from somewhere. So they either came from FIPS 200, which we'll show you in a minute is a list of minimum security requirements for federal organizations, and they just sort of co-opted those and repurposed those for non-federal use. They also come from NIST 853, which we've already covered in some moderate detail already. And then they are all based on a driving regulation, which is 32 CFR 2002. So why are we pointing this out? Well, we can take certain things, certain characteristics and traits of these documents to better understand how we can structure and stage the non-technical components of our implementations. So let's just run through this briefly. FIPS 200, if we dig into that document, we see some really interesting things as a preface statement for the requirements themselves. Now, if you haven't actually taken a look at FIPS 200, you're going to open up FIPS 200, you're going to get to the security requirements, and you're going to say, wait, these are like the exact language or almost exact language of a lot of the basic requirements that are in NIST 800.171, and that is the relationship. These minimum security requirements were brought over to build out 800.171. That means that not all NIST 800.171 requirements actually came from 853. A lot of them are informed by it, but they may have also come from FIPS 200. So of note, the FIPS 200 document says organizations must develop and promulgate formal documented policies and procedures in order to make sure that these specific requirements are satisfied. So that tells me that at least at a minimum, for just the basic requirements in 801.71, those original requirements expect policy and procedure to be in place. So again, as we were talking about before, if we want to beat up on the process maturity requirements for CMMC, you can, but that doesn't absolve you from the requirement of having policies and procedures. I just want to point out as well, if you go into NIST 853, which is the next document we have here, and actually look at the control summaries in the back of the document, they tell you some things. I have one example that I'm going to show you in a second, but one that I didn't have up here is individual controls are marked with a little checkbox next to them in the control summaries. It tells you whether or not it is a high assurance control. A high assurance control, according to NIST, is a control that, if in place, increases the confidence that all other security claims are true. So when we're thinking about an assessor looking to determine their depth and coverage of their future assessment of your organization or your internal self-assessment, which type of control is going to more rapidly increase confidence that all the other claims are true? It's going to be the high assurance controls. I may need to look at fewer high assurance controls to know that I have the appropriate depth and coverage than other types of controls. Well, guess what controls are always marked as a high assurance control? Policies and procedures. So every -1 control from every NIST family is marked as a high assurance control. That should tell us something about their importance in our non-technical implementation. Now, when we get to NIST 853, this is the big controls catalog, originally written for federal organizations, but in the latest revisions, it's being adapted for any organization to use. You're going to find way, way more controls in here than you would actually need to implement in order to satisfy, let's say, a data privacy-driven model like CUI safeguarding requirements, but they're all there and then some. Now, 853, as I mentioned in the control summaries, gives us some very interesting information that allows us to do some early sorting on controls that need to be put in place and determine what kind of control am I looking at here. Now, in the control summaries, you'll be given an identification of either an O or an S for controls that are in the catalog. Now, an S is going to be a control that, as you can see here, is implemented in an information system. I'm configuring a system. It's done through technical means. I'm going to assign this to technical teams. Then I've got O controls, which are organizational controls. NIST's expectation here is that those are going to be put in place by individuals through non-technical means. So I can already start to do some early mapping and sorting to figure out what my starting point is for a lot of these controls. As you know, CMMC is mapped to 853 controls. It's their informative reference. So if I can look at a CMMC practice or an 801.71 requirement, in both of those documents, I've also got at least one NIST 853 control tied to it. I can go to these control summaries and see how the cookie crumbles from a systems versus organizational implementation. Now, finally, all of this is driven by regulation. And as I mentioned, we've got security controls. So then we get to 32 CFR 2002. That's our driving regulation. And here, I skipped ahead. This is effectively what we're looking at. We don't have to go back to the other slide. So 32 CFR is incorporating by reference all of those documents we just mentioned. It's incorporating FIPS 200, it's incorporating NIST 801.71, and it's incorporating NIST 853. It's aware. It understands those exist, it talks about them, and it also has requirements of its own. So at the end of the day, where we find ourselves is that NIST 801.71, if you want to understand what's going on there, you can always look back at 853 and understand how we arrived at a derived requirement. If you're stuck there, you can always go back to FIPS 200 and see what the original minimum security requirement was that was handed out a long time ago under the FIPS program, and then overseeing all of that is our driving regulation, 32 CFR 2002. If I'm ever worried that my interpretation of a controls implementation from 853 or whether or not I'm meeting my minimum security requirements for FIPS 200 is really adequate, I can always go back to 32 CFR and see whether or not there are any specified requirements there and make sure I'm at least hitting that minimum watermark. Otherwise, I'm definitely going to be in violation of that regulation. Any questions there? Any meme-based commentary? No? Okay. So we've got these three components that are going to underpin a non-technical implementation. I brought you through in the order that they were mentioned in NIST 800-171. More often than not, we probably have to do a little reformulation to get these to start working together. So here's usually kind of what we end up with. At our core implementation, we probably need some sort of CUI safeguarding program. Now, a CUI safeguarding program is not as broad-based or holistic as an entire InfoSec program. We're not necessarily saying like this has to look exactly like ISO 27001, although gosh, wouldn't that be helpful? A CUI safeguarding program is probably going to take everything we know about 32 CFR 2002 and make sure that at a minimum, we're always hitting that as a table stakes sort of investment. Now, the safeguarding program in FIPS 200, by its nature, always says that we should have policies and procedures for at least our minimum security requirements. And so there's a bit of an overlap there. Our program obviously needs to direct the creation of policies and procedures, and then it needs to be aware of those procedures. I think one of the biggest failings or shortcomings of the way that 800-171 is talked about is that it just assumes that program management is already in place. In fact, all of the NIST 853 baselines do too. They just assume that the PM family, program management, is in place. Otherwise, how else could you do work? How else could you even have an information security program? And it's just so broadly assumed that we don't talk about it. And that's a problem, because if we don't talk about it, we can't get specificity back from the stakeholders, and we can't do what's required of us. So we need to start building our own program. At a minimum, it should just make sure that we can meet the safeguarding requirements that are in CFR 2002, and it should probably be just broad enough at least to cover our minimum security requirements under FIPS 200. Now, policies and procedures, again, under Appendix E of NIST 800-171, we're told under the tailoring criteria that these are just so blatantly obvious that they are expected to be implemented without specification. That's the exact language from the tailoring criteria. So these are so on the nose obvious we don't have to talk about them because you're already doing them. Is that fair? No, but it's the way that this was all laid out in the tailoring criteria. Policies and procedures are themselves security controls. So they're sort of part of that in an overlapping manner. 853 is obviously where we get much broader security controls. But let's think about this from the perspective of these different moving components that we have from a CMMC perspective. So here's effectively what we're dealing with. If we've got program, and then we've got policies and procedures, and then we've got CMMC practices, when we think about the process maturity objectives in CMMC that have to do with resource planning, so again, our level 3 process objectives, they're talking about things like high-level management intent and commitment and strategic decisions and how we're going to build out and resource the effort. Those are things that usually happen in a consolidated manner because everything's competing for the same time and resources in an organization. So that's going to usually be a program level type implementation. So I usually recommend that organizations would take all of their process maturity objectives at level 3 for all of the resource planning requirements, move those up at the program level and take care of them there. If we drill down, you do actually find some CMMC practices that are tied to program management controls in 853. We're mostly talking about our risk management strategy, and we're talking about our insider threat awareness program. So I'm going to shift those over into that program column as well. Those are obviously always tied to a NIST 853 control, so you can see we've got those there. Now, when we get down into policies and procedures, we've got our level 2 process maturity objectives for documented policy, documented process. That's going to be up top there. As we sort of shift down, there's actually going to be several CMMC practice objectives that directly call out policy. So I have a policy on this topic, yes, no, determination statement. If I don't have it, I'm not going to make it through the assessment of that control implementation. So just doing some basic keyword analysis, we know that there are some policies that come to the forefront in an assessment. And then obviously we have NIST controls, as I mentioned, the -1 controls that are actually tied to policy and procedure. Just because there's 17 in there doesn't actually mean that it's a domain to family match. It's just how that came out count-wise. When we get into the actual operationalizing the overall program, we get into the CMMC practices themselves. We've already solved for some of those practice objectives at the program and policy and procedure level. So then we've got a remaining 365 practice objectives. So we talked about earlier, you've got 320 practice objectives, assessment objectives in NIST 800-171A, 320. At the practice level for CMMC Level 3, we have 382 practice objectives. Then we have our process maturity objectives, which is another 323. So all told, across practice objectives and process objectives, we've now at CMMC Level 3, as it exists today, we've got 705 data points that we're going to be graded against. That is the cumulative scoring methodology that's going to determine whether we get a pass or a fail on the CMMC assessment or whether we've got remediation to do in a limited window. And then if we just take the referenced informative 853 controls, you can see those striped as well. We've got quite a few tied to the performance of specific CMMC practices. So that's, if we just added those up, a very rough math weighted distribution, you can see that practices are still the bulk of where the action happens, but there are other preliminary activities that would help set up success in those areas. So when we talk about the way that we plan for these non-technical implementations, as we were talking about earlier, just having the description of the practice or the 800-171 requirement doesn't really help us all that much. So here we've got AC2016. I think that's 3.1.3 in 800-171. So we have to control the flow of CUI in accordance with approved authorizations. Pretty straightforward, right? If we go to NIST 853, this is control AC4, information flow enforcement, I believe, and it is tagged as an S, a systems implementation, expected to be put in place through technical means. So if we get into some of the actual assessment objectives or determination statements, as we would call them, on the CMMC side of the world, they're called practice objectives. We run into some interesting things here that if we're just paying attention to the base requirement, we're totally going to miss. So let's just run through this. My first determination statement, information flow control policies are defined. Policies. Next, methods and enforcement mechanisms for controlling the flow of CUI are defined. Defined tends to mean something from a paper-pushing perspective. Next, designated sources and destinations, whether it be networks or people or devices, those are all identified. So identified, not the most helpful language in a determination statement, but it probably means I can point to it somewhere. I can identify it. Item D, authorizations for controlling the flow of CUI are defined. And then finally, those approved authorizations are enforced. Now, if we just read AC2016, we'd only see the language in D and E. We'd be totally blind to the rest of this. So again, we have to go back to the objective level determination statements and identify what is actually required of us. So just for kicks, I went into AC4, which is the 853 control used to build these objectives. And I went into the quantum realm. I went into DoD control correlation identifier statements that are actually used to link policies down all the way to system settings. And I pulled out all of the settings that actually tie to these objectives in AC4. You can see for items B and C, I actually had to bring in a security control enhancement for AC4. Because it's sort of a choose your own adventure when you get into that particular control. It's got like 20 different enhancements you can choose from. It's like going to Chipotle, but for security. And so you basically, you can dig through here and you see all of these control correlation identifier statements that are sort of like the subatomic decomposition of all of these determination statements. Now, here's what's interesting about this. How many of these require the organization through non-technical means to define something? This is an S control. This is a systems implementation. And how much paper pushing and administrative work and decision making do I have to put in front of that to then actually make the security claim that I'm actually enforcing the flow of information? So this is what is waiting for us under the hood of a more detailed examination of CMMC 800-171, CUI safeguarding, writ large. So if we are going to get through this in one piece and effectively, we have to start doing some things with these broader sets of practice objectives in order to focus the overall effort so that we can spend less time pontificating about the what ifs for all of these different determination statements. So if we're going to focus our overall controls implementations, I think there's a couple of things that we can do on the front end that'll make us successful. The first thing that I think we can do is we can specify the measures of performance. Now, when we get into these kinds of discussions, there's a lot of open-ended identification, definition type practice objectives or determination statements that don't really lead anywhere. It's still leaving it completely up to you to decide what you're going to inject into that implementation, whether it's these organizationally defined parameters that we talked about or whatever it may be. So if I can adopt, more pre-built sets of useful guidance from other existing authoritative sources, I might be able to cut down on the amount of discussion that goes into actually starting to take the first steps to implement and having it all written down along the way. So when we get into this, I'm just going to suggest 3 potential sources you could use. This is not an exhaustive list. Oh my God, there are so many different places you can go to get someone's well-documented opinion of what a successful controls implementation looks like. I'm just going to give you some starter dough here, okay? So the 3 we're going to look at is NIST 853 itself, because there's some really good stuff baked in there. We're going to look at just the supplemental guidance that's provided with controls and see if we can draw out some useful information that helps us in our implementation. The next thing we're going to look at are FedRAMP, federally assigned parameters. Now, I couldn't help but notice that the name of this conference, CS2, has cloud in the name. Does anybody know, under paragraph B of DFAR 7012, how adequate security is defined for a cloud system? Scott, you can't raise your hand. Any takers? For non-federal systems that you own and operate, right, we've got NIST 800-171. What about cloud? Well, DFAR 7012, paragraph B, says for any cloud systems that are going to be used to store, process, or transmit CUI, the cloud service provider has to provide security controls that are equivalent, gray area term, buy me a beer later, equivalent to FedRAMP moderate baselines. So if I were to, for example, go to the FedRAMP document templates and pull down an SSP or a controls implementation for 853 mod, which is what's used to build FedRAMP moderate, I would have these things called federally assigned parameters that are already baked into the model. If I know what 853 control I'm looking at, I can literally just pop that right into a CMMC practice. So let's see what that does for us. And then we've got CNSS 1253. This is a national security systems overlay for 853. Hits different targets, hits different controls. Let's see if we start to use these in different ways, if this could shorten our overall planning and implementation timelines. So first things first, 853. I'm just going to give you an example here. When we get to the 193 practice in CMMC, which is social media usage and restrictions, that's based on PL4 Security Enhancement 1. In 853 land, you never use the security enhancement without the base control. So if I'm going to use Security Enhancement 1, I have to use PL4. What is PL4? Rules of behavior. Now, hey, this is required for FedRAMP moderate equivalency, but you can define equivalency however you want. I'm just going to say, what if we used this particular control as the base layer for our social media restrictions that we have to have in the 193 practice? Well, we've got 2 parts here, Part A and Part B. These are called subparts of the control. And the first thing we have to do is just make available a rules of behavior document that describes what people's responsibilities are in the system, et cetera, and then we need a signed acknowledgement. Now, if we took the supplemental guidance for this control that's just right underneath the control description in 853, we'd see a couple of things. First of all, for Part B, hey, signed acknowledgements don't have to be a signed piece of paper. It could be a radio button. It could be just a click acknowledgement, whatever it might be for the system. So that's fine. But for Part A, hey, just so you know, the related controls section of this described control gives you a list of controls that are relevant to put in a rules of behavior document. Really? Well, look, what are those related controls? Oh, well, I mean, it's all these. So here's all of the NIST 853 controls. If I just map those to CMMC practices, mapping's already done. I don't have to do it. I just go into the model appendices for CMMC and just look to the right. These are all of the 853 controls that have a little brother practice in CMMC. And then this is just a rudimentary attempt to take the determination statements that are most relevant for each of those CMMC practices and say, well, what could be in my rules of behavior document? Well, I mean, I could be telling people what kinds of system functions that they're allowed to execute on the system. You know, don't try and subvert security controls and run a bunch of scripts. I'm allowed to talk about what types of permitted remote access are identified for the organization, whether or not I'm going to allow certain other types of access. Oh, I'm going to make everyone aware of the security risks associated with the use of the system. All of these other things that we usually have people struggle with when they're doing their controls implementation because they're just sort of like these nebulous, out there, informative topics. Well, let's consolidate all of that into a large document and say, this is the playbook for how you use our systems. Then if I go actually to PL4 Security Enhancement 1, this is our social media restrictions. You can see here I get all sorts of helpful guidance in the supplemental guidance for exactly what should be in my rules of behavior document for the usage of social media, what I should post online, whether or not I should even use company equipment to access social media, you name it. So again, having this in place and this supplemental guidance would directly serve to satisfy the practice objective that we've got for 193, where we actually do training on this topic. So you can sort of see how 853 supplemental guidance can just fill in a lot of gaps in what you see when you look at a determination statement and say, how the heck am I going to accomplish this? So if we've got 853 and the supplemental guidance that we find there, we could then look at FedRAMP federally assigned parameters. So assuming that we're going to at least make some sort of effort to be equivalent to the FedRAMP moderate baseline, what would we find there? Well, if we get into this example here, media marking, if we just inject the existing supplemental guidance from 853, which I believe we've got here, Part A requires that any of our markings of media follows NARA guidance. A lot of people don't realize 853 is very CUI aware. Like, it's not over there and then CUI is over here. Do Control F for controlled unclassified or for CUI as just as a keyword in 853 and have your mind blown. So again, all your markings have to be driven by 32 CFR 2002 and NARA guidance. Great, I get it, fine. What about for Part B? I'm allowed to exempt types of information system media from marking as long as it remains within a controlled environment. Who here has heard of a controlled environment before when reading 32 CFR 2002 or maybe like NARA guidance or mandatory DoD COI training? Is that ringing a bell for anyone? Does anybody remember what a controlled environment is? Any takers? Bueller? Controlled environment is at least one physical barrier preventing three things from happening: access to the information, observing the information, overhearing conversations about the information. So wait, you're telling me in the 853 control, in the subpart that handles exemptions, I'm being told that as long as something's in a controlled environment with at least one physical barrier, I might not have to mark it? Whoa, what's going on here? This is like, it's like making sense. Like I can actually have physical compensating controls that then don't require me to slap stickers on everything. So what would be like something I wouldn't want to exempt from that? Well, the FedRAMP moderate baseline gives us a federally assigned parameter. If my, here we go. Oh, whatever you do, no removable media types can be exempted. Why? Well, first of all, just from a CMMC perspective, I already have a requirement that I have to prohibit the use of removable storage if it doesn't have a clearly identifiable owner, right? What's a great way to identify the owner of a piece of removable media? Probably a marking. Okay, great. So that was already just kind of like, goes without saying, but now we've got some specificity here that I can exempt other kinds of media as long as they're in a controlled environment, but not removable media. So that's another way that I can sort of fill in some of the guidance gaps that might already be in like 853. I might not get an answer to every question. So here's a way that I can sort of patch over that. So next we would have CNSS, so our National Security Systems Overlay. Here we just get additional definitions and specifications that can be super handy for acting as a tiebreaker in early implementation discussions or planning. So again, we'll take a look at an example here. I had enough room to actually put up a core 853 control and its security enhancement because there's two CMMC practices addressed here. So this is for wireless access. AC18A and B says, first of all, you have to come up with some usage restrictions and configuration requirements, all this good stuff for wireless connectivity. And then you actually have to authorize access to the system. And then security enhancement 1, you have to protect that wireless access using authentication of, and you've got a selection to make, either users or devices or both, and then you have to use encryption as well. So you can see here I've already got the NIST supplemental guidance pulled up. So like what could be a restriction or configuration or connection requirement? Oh, my guidance says that certain authentication protocols provide an appropriate amount of protection. So like, even if I'm not a technical person, who here is technical? Technical person. Do we do EAP-TLS? EAP-TLS? Do we do that? Yeah. Oh, okay, we do that. Okay, so is that a usage restriction or is that a configuration requirement? No? Okay, what am I dealing with here? Is this describing how I set up a system?
I would assume it's talking about policy.
Okay, well, here's the thing. I'm trying to write policy, and you're going to be doing the work. So if you could just tell me what to put in here, I'll write it down and then put some must-shall language in front of it, and then we know, you and I know that we're already meeting the policy. Is that a good dialogue that we could have?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So me as a non-technical person, I can take this information and say, do we do this? Which of these is it? Okay, I'm going to turn that into a sentence. Thank you. And then we can come back to that later in a technical implementation and say, is that still true? Okay, great. We'll probably have to do some other things to prove it to an assessor, but at least we know that our policy is a self-fulfilling prophecy of the things we're already currently doing. So again, this is where this information can be helpful. Now, when we get into these tiebreaker situations like we see here, I have to do authentication of either or both. We could look at existing guidance. So in this case, the CNSS overlay says, hey, you're going to do authentication two ways. You're going to authenticate devices to wireless networks. And then after that's done, you've got to authenticate users to services. So it's not just the device just gets onto the network and can immediately grant access to CUI. I still need domain authentication to be in front of that application access where I'm going to actually get to the CUI. So that can be really helpful, right? I could pass that over the fence to a technical person and say, is this making sense to you? How would we do that? Okay, write that up, put that in place, that's fine. I'm going to write that into policy. I'm going to write that into system security plan, whatever it might be. So again, we can be filling gaps in what the implementation might need to look like just by adding in these types of specification that are already available to us from these publicly available authoritative sources that none of us wrote and that we can always point back to as supporting rationale for why we made the decision that we made. So just for kicks, having gone through those steps and putting that guidance in place would have helped us with these specific CMMC practice objectives. So When we get into the rest of the things that could help us with our overall implementation, let's say we've got a bunch of things specified, and now we're getting ready to actually do the thing, implement the control, satisfy the objectives, be ready to be assessed. We tend to experience a colossal logjam in resource allocation and the ability to follow through on all of our well-laid plans. And that's to be expected, right? We're all resource-limited organizations. We've got limited teams. Sometimes we're outsourcing. There's all sorts of things that go into this. And so what we found is that there's usually a paralysis of analysis where organizations don't know where to begin and they don't know how to make consistent progress. We get stutter-stop sort of implementation efforts that are a big sprint followed by some serious blockages, and then no one knows exactly where they're going to get their next satisfied objective from, how they're going to improve that SPRS score, whatever it may be. And so I'm just going to suggest a possible way to go through this. This is very high level. This is very rudimentary. How many people here have done something like built an Eisenhower matrix, the important versus the urgent, or things like that? There's all sorts of different ways that you can apply just common sense methodologies to the ordering and focus of your implementation. I'm just going to suggest a possible way to do it here. This is something called a focus funnel. This was developed by a guy named Rory Vaden on a business management book, so it's not even IT or cybersecurity. I find that for non-technical implementations, a lot of times business methodologies tend to work a little bit better. Simple concept. Anytime you're about to begin a task, you have to ask yourself, are there certain things that are true about this task that make it worth working on? So first question you can ask yourself is, for the task at hand, can I eliminate it? Do I actually even have to do it? And I think that more often than not, organizations don't ask themselves that question often enough. They don't ask whether or not the system that they're handling or that they're trying to secure is even a covered contractor information system, or whether or not the underlying conditions that are in the requirement are even true for their organization. They don't try and figure out whether or not this is a wasted effort or not that isn't actually doing anything to safeguard CUI. The next question we can ask yourself is, of the activities I'm about to embark on, can I automate them? Can I set these up in a way so that the activity that needs to be performed can be either partially or fully performed without my active attention? If so, I can increase my throughput in a big way. The next question I could ask myself is this activity something I can delegate? Now, there's always risks to delegation. Anytime I'm going to risk or delegate something to someone else, I run the risk that it's not going to be done the way I would do it. So I have to figure out what my absolute must be involved types of implementations are going to be for this, and what are some of the things that I can hand off to someone else. If I already took the time to build in a bunch of specification, which we just talked about, I might be able to delegate a lot more of this. And then finally, if this is something that I truly must do myself and then it should be done, I can just figure out, is it something that I need to schedule for later or that I should be doing right this minute? So let's just go through some possible examples here. The first step, as I said, is to eliminate. So can I eliminate any non-applicable controls? Won't go into too much detail here, but of course you can request exceptions or planned variances for controls that don't apply to your organization. That is done directly through the DoD CIO's office. You make a request, you get a response, you keep that response on file. If it's approved or allowed, you're good to go. Some common examples that we run into, I don't use wireless networking in my isolated CUI handling environment, so I don't think I should have to worry about wireless requirements. Agree. Okay, great. Here's your planned exemption from the DoD. Keep that on file. I don't use mobile devices, so it's not going to be a problem as long as mobile devices don't exist in the environment. We've also seen the DoD CIO weigh in on situations like whether or not the local device being used to access a virtual desktop is itself a covered system or not. And they'll give you conditions. Hey, as long as all of these things are in place, as long as you can't copy and paste data out of it, can't do this, can't do that, then we would allow that. So then you would need to have that documented exemption on file, and then you might have a smaller system scope as an example. So these are things that we can go through and ask for exemptions and actually reduce the number of requirements that need to be put in place. There's obviously an art to this. You don't want to inject too much of your own opinion into a request, because then it might cause the person responding to that request to look past the actual intent. So just keep things open and based on what's written already in regulations, and propose something where the DoD can bring conditions for allowing it into your response and give you what you're looking for. So the next step we could take is to automate security controls. This is substantively different from talking about systems implementations, right? So if I've got a systems implementation that's expected to be put in place through technical means, that might still involve me doing a lot of manual configuration on machines over and over and over again. So there's a difference here between something that's performed by a system and something where the entire activity or parts of the activity are automated. So just wanted to point out that differentiation. When we get into the 853 controls that sit underneath CMMC and 800-171, this is just a little bit of a data analysis exercise here. These are all of the CMMC practices for which the underlying 853 control either has an automation security control enhancement, talks about automation in its supplemental guidance, or specifically uses the word automate in any of its subparts. So just using that as our baseline to find fertile ground for potential automation, these are the CMMC practices where we see that included. Now the color coding here, all we're saying is that if it's not shaded at all, that means that it was already a systems implementation. So we're just not trying to give ourselves too much credit for automating a systems implementation. It was probably going to have some automated capabilities anyways. If it's the lighter green, it's one of those either or implementations in the control summaries, an O/S that could go either way. So again, you could probably have automated this without a lot of innovation or anything like that. But for the green, the darker green practices, these were originally tagged as an organizational implementation to be put in place through non-technical means, which means if I can automate these more administrative processes, chances are I'm actually stripping cost and inefficiency out of the performance of the activities that make me compliant. So again, just a thought experiment. Next, we could delegate, and we tend to do delegation through defined roles and responsibilities. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Everyone's always looking for resources that they can use for this purpose. I'm just going to suggest one. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of possible ways to carve out roles and responsibilities, but you can do better capacity planning for how quickly you can implement if you understand how full someone's plate is from all of their delegated responsibilities. So a resource that you could use, this is very, very rudimentary, okay? But the Department of Homeland Security issues approved security handbooks and policy directives for sensitive systems. And what you will find in those sensitive systems security handbooks, which is hundreds of pages, are individual breakdowns and guidance for how to implement a topic. Then you'll have a policy directive that's, guess what, mapped to an 853 control. So you can kind of do some rough association here. And then from there, you'll be given a table of responsibilities for each unique role that's carved out in the handbook document. So this is just an example of requirements for the use of laptops. The CISO has a job to do, the ISSM has a job to do, the sysadmin, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of organizations that we interact with don't have teams this big, right? And so you a lot of times end up having to consolidate down some of these distinct roles into like a more of like a role grouping or a duty area. But it's at least saying, okay, on this topic, I could take this action, this other party could take this action, and then users maybe have like a more general responsibility in that area. So this might be a way to say, hey, for these set of practice objectives that I have to put in place on this topic, who could I dole these out to from a role and responsibility perspective? And does that allow me to do some capacity planning to understand, wow, I am really overloading my system administrator, like a lot. So does that mean that I need to do some additional resource planning? Do I need to have some more projects done by an outsourced MSP? What is going to help us achieve that additional throughput? And then finally, scheduling controls implementations. This is probably an area where I don't have a lot of concrete guidance for you because there's so many different ways that you can go after this. But again, just to run a little bit of a thought experiment here. If I just take my responsibilities under the FedRAMP moderate baseline, and I just look at the FedRAMP parameters for frequency, for how often I have to do a thing, for all my daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annual tasks under FedRAMP moderate, I have 1,584 activities to perform every year. And then if we just assume that every control from 853 that I have to put in place is a one-time controls implementation, that means that if somehow I can go from implemented to operating a program in year one, top to bottom, I've got 1,700 things to do in order to implement. Does this create any motivation to try and eliminate or automate or delegate, like at all? Like for me, this was a huge wake-up call. Like we've got a lot of work to do here if we're going to meet all of our DFARS requirements for FedRAMP moderate equivalency in the cloud, and then also implement all of our controls for 800-171 and for CMMC. If we roll all of that up, I've got a lot of things to schedule. And so I should probably have recurring calendar appointments built out for a lot of these activities and go to war with manually performed activities that I can potentially automate. That has to be at the core of a modern information security program implementation. Otherwise, I will just die in the implementation details. So before we go any further, I have just a couple of expanded examples that we can walk through of how to go through this focusing process. But I've been running my mouth for quite a bit here. So what questions do we have in regards to pre-specifying work before we begin or focusing the effort overall? Anything on those topics that we wanted to unpack? We're good? All right. So let's run into these expanded examples. So this is just touching on some of the things we talked about throughout this process. So first things first, we talked about the need for a program as sort of a high-level driving force to bury all of our level 3 process objectives in for resource planning, create inroads for all of our policy and procedure documents, et cetera, et cetera. I just wanted to point out that we're required to have high-level strategy as part of our process objectives. What would be some good high-level strategies for a program? I don't know about you, I could come up with some really cool strategies. Things like running a focus funnel, leveraging predefined parameters, et cetera. But at a minimum, my strategy should probably include the safeguarding requirements for 32 CFR 2002. So what are those? Well, establishing controlled environments. We talked about this idea of physical boundaries, preventing anyone from accessing, observing, or overhearing conversations about CUI. That's a bare minimum for anything that we're going to do. Also making sure that all those conditions are met in that controlled environment, and then also when we're outside of a controlled environment. So if we are at a coffee shop or whatever it might be, what are my minimums? Keeping that CUI under direct control. A lot of people don't give themselves enough credit for controlling CUI. That bag is a controlled environment if it's providing at least one physical boundary. Your key card to your hotel is an access device that's going to create a controlled environment if you lock your hotel room when you leave, and maybe make different housekeeping decisions than you made when you got here. The other requirement would obviously be that we're just going to overall protect the confidentiality of CUI. Most organizations aren't rolling up all of their 800-171 work or their CMMC implementations into what is the actual goal here of putting all these practices in place. And it's exactly that. So if we were able to have that sit over top of our overall program, we could start to build out things like our risk management strategy, which is PM9 and 853, and that's the 146 practice in CMMC. We need some starting inputs though, and these are relevant for that. Policies and procedures. Again, we talked about this before, but just to kind of expound upon this, if I go through the individual subparts for the policy and procedure controls that are talked about in 853, you can see that all of the process maturity objectives that are in the assessment guide for CMMC, whoa, things just got real. We'll try and go back if we can. You can see that all of the process maturity objectives for CMMC Level 3 are actually directly attributed to specific components of the control that is in the -1 control itself. So all of my policy statements that are in AC-1 or AU-1 or any of the NIST families, they mean something from a process maturity perspective in CMMC. So those are directly correlated. We want to do something with those. I don't think my slide transitions are coming back, so let's just start where we're at. This is an expanded example of taking an 853 control, breaking it down by subpart, and then seeing what we could do to pre-specify and then focus this overall implementation. So right now we're looking at PE2, which is physical access authorizations. PE2 is the work we do to set up, then controlling physical access, which is PE3. So you can see here I've got my different subparts. I have to do all these different things. So if we took the supplemental guidance from 853, we can start to answer some of our own questions. I need to maintain a list of individuals with authorized access. Hey, 853 says this control only applies to the areas in the facilities that we don't want to let people in from a publicly accessible perspective. So I don't have to maintain a list of people who are allowed to walk into my visitor entrance and say hello. Traveling salesmen do not have to be added to my list of authorized individuals. Only when they move into a controlled area where we've deemed non-public do I have to start maintaining a list of who we should allow. If we have to issue credentials for facility access, hey, here's some examples. So credentials, a little broad. What could credentials be? Badges, ID cards, smart cards, you name it. Here's some actual examples. Could management more easily make a decision on what they're going to use as their authorization credentials if I give them examples? Perhaps. Sometimes it's helpful for focusing the effort. How often do I need to review the list of who should be allowed in the environment? FedRAMP says once a year. I'm going to do what FedRAMP says. So when we get into the next setup here, which is actually enforcing that access, that's PE3. You can see here I've just bolded the key words that are in each of these subparts. I'm going to enforce by verifying and controlling. I'm going to maintain certain things like logs. I'm going to provide certain safeguards to control access, so on and so forth. The list goes on. Now, if I go into ones that are directly related to CMMC practice objectives, you can see some of those correlations here. In this case, PE3 actually spans across multiple CMMC practices, so it's a more consolidated view of the effort that I have to put in place for my facility security and controlling that access. So without just reading through these, you can go look at those later. If we get into how we're going to satisfy this, here are some of our supplemental guidance items we can use to pre-specify. So if I'm going to enforce physical access authorizations, I'm going to specifically say that 853 calls out facility access points, so like the perimeter doors for the building, and then interior access points to information systems themselves, so like maybe my IT closet or my server room, things like that. If I'm going to control ingress or egress, I have a requirement here that I have to define what those systems or devices are going to be. FedRAMP says, and we're going to get to this in a minute, physical access control systems, devices, and guards. What? I'm going to want to do something about that. Okay, so then I'm going to have to maintain physical audit logs. According to NIST, that could be either an automated log or a written, combination of both, don't care. Let's skip down to escorting visitors. FedRAMP says I only have to do that wherever the information system resides. And then as far as how often I inventory my physical access devices, that's going to be at least once a year. So again, we're starting to fill this out a little bit more with a little more pre-specified detail so that there's fewer questions later on. So if I incorporate these specifications into the statements, I'm going to enforce physical access authorizations at the outside perimeter and in controlled areas where the information system lives. I'm going to control ingress and egress as much as I hate it right now. We'll see if we can do anything about it. Access control devices and guards. I'm going to maintain written or automated access logs. I'm going to use cameras and isolation of system components in areas where I can't actually put physical security controls. And then I'm going to do escorts for anyone who's going to move through a restricted area. And then I'm going to do annual inventories and rotate combination keys, things like that. So next focusing step, can I eliminate anything? Well, I really, really, really hate having to pay for guards on top of my physical access controls because that's a lot of money and that's not something I do today. So what I would do in this case is I would go to the controls implementation summary for my cloud service provider and read whether or not they've got physical access devices and guards. Guess what? If they have FedRAMP equivalency, they do. If you go read the system security plan for Microsoft or AWS and their controls implementations and their system security plans, oh, they got guards. They got guards on guards on guards. So you're fine. Now you go and read the customer responsibility matrix for what's left over for you to do. And for PE3, do you know what there will be? Nothing. There's nothing. You don't have to also send your guards to their cloud data center to then put another perimeter around their guards. You don't have to do that. And so if I was to take this and say, okay, I'm not going to do guards because from a FedRAMP moderate equivalency perspective, I've got guards where I need them, then I can collapse that to physical access devices or guards. And now that's a little bit less robust of a control. So let's just drop down to physical access devices themselves. So if we're going to automate security controls, back up in PE2, which was the authorization control, we were told that we could use all sorts of automated systems in order to do building access. So what if I just used badges or smart cards instead of having like a manual process for people to like check in and like know who they are and things like that? If I had smart cards for facility access, that would probably speed things up quite a bit, especially when we're talking about maintaining logs. So if we just bake those into the original statements, we're going to use badges or smart cards for all of that. We're good to go. Now this is a much more automated controls implementation. And then we would get into delegating roles and responsibilities. So this is just, if I were to take the DHS 4300A sensitive systems handbook and look at which entity or individual in that handbook has the responsibilities for each of these subparts, I would find that, hey, turns out my facility managers are going to be responsible for all the doors and all of that stuff. And then my information system security officer is going to be the one who's responsible for managing who gets badge access, how often we inventory all of those badges, how do we revoke access when someone leaves the company, all of that good stuff. And you can see we've already automated some of those subparts so we don't have to assign a person because it's just an inherent nature of the system now. So that would be a way for us to break out some of these requirements and be much more focused. So that's the end of my slides.